Hi everyone, and welcome back. I'm joined today by Seyed Mohammad Marandi, a professor at Tehran University and also former advisor to Iran's nuclear negotiation team. So it's good to see you again.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Glenn. It's always an honor.
So I wanted to discuss Turkey because, well, Turkey is a very complicated actor. I guess you can call it a complicated region, and it's often difficult to comprehend exactly what Turkey is doing. Furthermore, it also competes for a lot of key security interests against a variety of actors. And I guess Erdogan, he often plays this overly complicated games, and he doesn't shy away from deception in the pursuit of his objectives. So this often results in tensions with a lot of countries, be it Iran, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Russia, and even its own NATO allies. I was wondering if you could shed some light on this. How do you see Turkey's core geopolitical objectives in the Middle East today, and perhaps also the main areas where it clashes with Iran?
I think it's important to keep in mind that for your younger audience, that in Turkey, the the Islamic movement was led by uh, Mr. Erbakan and Mr. Najmuddin Erbakan, who was a very courageous person and very anti-imperialist. His orientation was towards the global south. He was the sort of person that resistance movements across the region and across the world would have loved to have on his side, on their side. But when he came to power as prime minister in the 1990s, in the late 1990s, for a year, the army removed him. And of course, it wasn't NATO policy, US policy to have such a person in charge. And basically, through a process, they diluted the movement until ultimately Erdogan came to power. And while many thought that he was an extension, or his policies would be extension of that of Mr. Erdogan, Erbakan, uh, it was not to be, and he pursued very different policies. And his orientation was closer to NATO. His objective was to join the West, uh, but uh, but different in a different way than previous secular leaders of Turkey. So, in my opinion, the sidelining of Mr. Erbakan uh, was was a great loss and also a great success for the United States. Erdogan, his problem from the very beginning was that he believed, and many of his supporters believed, that his deceptive policies and his uh, fact that he would negotiate differently and pursue different objectives when negotiating with different people or different countries. Many thought that that was uh, very smart. But the reality is that what it has led to ultimately is a mistrust towards the Turkish government across the board. So when regional leaders gather, when they talk, when world leaders talk among themselves, they obviously in their discussions they make it clear to one another that they don't trust the president of Turkey. So he is known to be dishonest and deceptive. And I think that's a great problem for Turkey. So while he may make many tactical gains through these policies or this method of rule, I think it's led to many strategic miscalculations, and it has hurt Turkey a great deal. And I think that we are beginning to see this problem increase as time moves forward. So, in the case of, for example, Syria, Erdogan had extremely close relations with Assad. They and their wives would go together on vacation. That's how close they were. The two were closer to each other than probably any other two leaders in the region, because other leaders are not known to go out with their families on vacation. But after the so-called Arab Spring or the Awakening, uh, when the government in Libya was targeted by these oil and gas rich dictatorships in the Persian Gulf with the backing of the West, and that, of course, the Qatar played a central role. Erdogan also played a key role in this, and he joined the West in manipulating this awakening, the Arab Spring, which ultimately turned into something quite horrible. So after the overthrow of the Libyan government, and we see that thanks to this intervention, and thanks to these regimes, NATO regimes, Turkey and Qatar, Libya today is a demolished country, and it's still in the midst of a civil war. They moved on to Syria. And again, in the case of Syria, like in Libya, this was a NATO operation. So Operation Timber Sycamore, which, of course, we all know that Obama was behind this. And the fact that the United States used Al-Qaeda with Erdogan and with Qatar in Libya and in Syria. And we know the Jake Sullivan email to Hillary Clinton from February the 12th, 2012, saying that in Syria, Al-Qaeda is on our side. But it was the case in Libya too. We had Belhaj there, who was key, and his people who were key in overthrowing the Gaddafi government. So Erdogan, his role has been within the framework of NATO, but he's been in dialogue with other countries, but he ultimately stabs them in the back, as in the case of Syria. His occupation of northern Iraq and his dealings with the government, the local government in Erbil, the Kurdish government, as a tool against the central government of Baghdad, is also well known. Or, for example, his relationship with Aliyev in Baku, his alliance, and both of them, of course, are allies of Israel, has been used to try to undermine Armenia. Of course, Armenia is not without its own faults. Armenia went and occupied parts of the Republic of Azerbaijan, but now it's the reverse, and Erdogan and Aliyev are trying to undermine Armenian sovereignty. So we see that whether it's directed towards Russia or Armenia or Iran or Iraq or Syria, in this part of the world, all these governments, all these people have problems with Erdogan. And I think that is coming back to haunt him. In the case of Syria, we are seeing this beginning to be a big issue, because he aligned himself with the United States, undermined Syria, his old friend Assad, and he helped kill hundreds of thousands of people with the Qataris and with NATO, and by bringing in tens of thousands of foreign fighters in 2012 and 2013. An important point, an important footnote for your viewers to keep in mind is that Iran, the resistance, Hezbollah did not get involved in Syria until 2013, mid-2013. And that's when tens of thousands of foreign fighters had already been brought into the country. So this was not Syrians against Syrians. And that's when Iran began to get involved, in Hezbollah, and then, of course, later on in 2015, the Russians. So when Erdogan with the Israelis, because the Israelis were also helping Al-Qaeda and ISIS, alongside the Syrian occupied Golan Heights, which is well documented. They were all working in partnership with one another to undermine Syria. Of course, the Israeli regime and Erdogan have their rivalries, but they both wanted their own separate spheres of influence. What Erdogan, so for example, in Syria, after ultimately undermining Syria, we now see tensions rising between Turkey and Israel over spheres of influence, but they were working together to bring down Syria. Or, for example, during the 12-day war, when the Israeli regime attacked Iran, when they invaded, when they carried out this unprovoked assault, Turkey put pressure on the Armenian government to give up its sovereignty in the south alongside Iran's border. So that basically Turkey and the Republic of Azerbaijan would cut off Iran's link to Armenia, Georgia, the Black Sea, Eastern Europe, and Russia. And also to be able to establish what the Americans want, and that is an alternative route to Central Asia. In other words, a rival route to the Belt and Road initiative of so it would not only disrupt the Russian north-south corridor potentially, but it would also disrupt the Belt and Road initiative and serve as an alternative pro-NATO route. And we know that, of course, Erdogan is not sanctioned, Turkey is not sanctioned, because he is working in coordination with the United States in line with Israeli interests. True, as I said, there are tensions in Syria, but elsewhere they've been working together during this whole Holocaust in Gaza. We've seen that Turkey and Erdogan and the Israeli regime continue to do business as usual. So while Erdogan rants about Israel, he transports Aliyev's oil, Baku oil, cheap oil to Israel. He does business, ships come and go. They have trade relations, but also political relations. There's an embassy, and there are direct flights. When you go to Istanbul to the airport, you see flights that are going to Tel Aviv. So he's playing this game where verbally he's pro-Palestine. He gives scholarships to Palestinians. It's his public diplomacy. But when it comes to dealing with the Israeli regime, his relationship with them is far deeper. But all of these policies, you can see how this causes tension. And the tensions now with Russia are rising. China is not happy. He is using Chinese, Central Asian, Russian, Pakistani, Indian, and even Iranian nationals, Iraqi nationals in his different Al-Qaeda and ISIS, his Takfiri forces, the Salafi, Wahhabi groups in Syria, which do pose a threat to these Asian countries. And we all know how ISIS and Al-Qaeda have always been tools used by the West, created by the West, to disrupt countries or regions that are not aligned to the West. So he is very much in the American camp. But Turkey is important, and Turkey is not Erdogan. So for Iran, Turkey is much more than Erdogan. It's a country. It's a large country. It's a country with a Sufi tradition, which is similar to Shia culture, and therefore for Iran, the relationship with Turkey remains important. But he is very problematic. But again, it's now causing problems because in Syria we see that he cannot compete with the Israeli regime. There's no doubt. And this was clear from day one, that when push comes to shove, Trump or whoever's in the White House will stand firmly behind Netanyahu or whoever's in charge in Tel Aviv. So right now, Syria is sort of becoming a black hole. his proxy in Syria, Jolani, or the West's proxy in Syria, Jolani, is floundering. We have renewed clashes in the south over the last 24 hours uh, between the Druze militias and the pro Jolani or Hashara militias. Things are not good in Syria. And when things are not good for Syria, that's not good for the neighboring countries either, because Syria is becoming a black hole. As I think I probably said on your show a while ago that this was a tactical victory for Erdogan and Biden at that time, as well as, of course, Netanyahu, who gloated about it. But I think it's a strategic failure for them.
Yeah, I think this whole idea of pursuing this neo-Ottoman policy of restoring wider influence in the region, it time and time again appears to come in direct conflict with the objective of actually getting along with members. I also keep noticing that, well, in the West, what often frustrates with Turkey is that it doesn't fall in line. And for me, this seems like more a lot of fault on the West as well, because they don't recognize that the world is multipolar. They have to diversify. They have to have many partners. They can't just subordinate all the time to the US. But for the Chinese, Russians, and others, I think as you said, getting increasingly frustrated because if Turkey pursues its own interests, that's to be given. But there's the efforts to harmonize interest with others, see where the common ground is, and to establish a status quo. It's very difficult because every time they seem to make a deal, it's deception that really kicks in, and it becomes too complicated, too many objectives at once. So it can be something small, like, for example, when the Russians handed over Azov commanders on the condition they wouldn't be released to Ukraine until after the war, and the Turkey does it anyways. These kind of things where they can't be trusted anymore, or the bigger issues such as Syria, where they thought, okay, let's find a deal where the interest of all the actors in the regions are taken into account, and meanwhile they're planning this jihadi proxy attack into Syria and toppling of Assad. So it's very difficult to make any long-term deals based even on accommodating Turkey's interests when you never know what Erdogan might do next. But of course, Turkey also has a key role in Iraq, mostly linked to the Kurdish issue. But on what areas can Iran and Turkey cooperate, and where do you see them ending up in, if not a clash, at least a dispute?
Well, as a private citizen, and I've never been anything but a private citizen, even when I was with the nuclear negotiating team in 2015 and again 3.5 years ago, I only was a media advisor. I've always refused to be in government. But as a private citizen, what I can say as my own opinion is that as long as Mr. Erdogan is in power, I think it's going to be very difficult to have a relationship with Turkey that is satisfactory to Iranians, because they can never trust him. No matter what agreement there is on any issue, he's just not someone who anyone trusts anymore. And that limits things. And of course, Erdogan has been trying, whether intentionally or otherwise, through using Salafism and Wahhabism. And you have to keep in mind that Qatar, which is really an American proxy, uh, the official ideology in Qatar is Wahhabism, and the biggest mosque in Doha, it's a huge mosque that I've seen, is called the Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab Mosque, and he is a key figure in the whole Takfiri world. He and Ibn Taymiyyah. So what Qatar and Turkey have effectively done is they've been pushing parts of Turkish society away from Sufism towards a very much tolerant Islam. towards Salafism and Wahhabism. And they've been using them as tools, of course, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere, in Lebanon. Something that I've witnessed. I've spoken to some of these Salafi and Wahhabi clerics running big and expensive so-called Islamic centers through Qatari money. Ever since Mohammed, I think, it's fair to say that ever since Mohammed bin Salman came to power, the the Wahhabi Salafi Takfiri movement has shifted towards Erdogan and Qatar rather than Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman, for his own reasons, has distanced himself from these groups to a large degree, but now it's under the control of this axis under the general, within the realms and the framework of NATO. So Turkish society is impacted by Salafism, and Salafism is sort of now shifting parts of Turkish society away from this traditional Sufi Islam. And that is going to be a problem because, as I said earlier, culturally speaking, Iran and Turkey are very similar, and they've been very similar. But of course, Wahhabism and Salafist Takfiris, they consider, for example, Shia to be infidels. So if they have access to me, they'll kill me, and or my wife, or my children, my neighbors. Uh, and we see how they behave now in Syria. Initially, when they carried out the slaughter against the Alawites, even the Europeans were defending them and saying, trying to make it the fault of these poor villagers and townspeople, and say, well, they were affiliated to the Assad government, which they weren't. Many of them were just, they were overwhelmingly just ordinary people. But then they moved on to Christians and the Druze more recently, and effectively, and this is something that I think was intentional from the beginning, not necessarily by Erdogan. I don't think that's the case. I don't think he looked that far into the future. But I think from the very beginning, the Americans were using Al-Qaeda because they've used them before in Afghanistan and Pakistan, as we all know, against the Soviet Union initially, but also against Iran later on. So they know how they work quite well. And, we also have the 9/11 experience. Whatever, taking, even if we accept the official narrative of 9/11, they know Al-Qaeda very well. And so by bringing Al-Qaeda to power successfully after 13 years of dirty war, it was natural that Syria will move towards explosion. It would implode. And why? Because Al-Qaeda is Salafi and Wahhabi. Of course, Wahhabism is a sort of subgroup of Salafism. But in any case, I'll loosely and inaccurately interchange the terms, somewhat inaccurately. But that they cause the minorities, who collectively are at least half the country, they cause them to distance themselves because they're all considered to be people whose lives are not, who can be killed, who are not worthy. So the Alawites, the Christians, the Druze, the Kurds, Sufis, the Ismailis, the secular, all of them in Syria are now under siege. And so they are, by bringing these groups to power, they encourage these minorities to tilt towards foreign powers. And in the case of the Druze, what they've done is that they've pushed these people out of fear, in most cases, towards the Israeli regime. Now, I would consider that to be wrong, and those who promote it as carrying out treason. But you can understand how ordinary people who feel fearful of their lives and who think they're about to be killed by these takfiri militias, how they could go to the Israeli regime for support. It's not. I don't condone it, but you can see why this happens. People out of desperation do many things. If I'm in that situation, only then can I judge whether only then if when I'm put in such an extreme situation can I understand this situation more clearly. So I think that from the very beginning, the objective by using ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria was to break up Syria, and that is because breaking up Syria has always been the objective of the Israeli regime. A fragmented Syria, a fragmented Lebanon, a fragmented region so that the Israeli regime could dominate. And Erdogan was key to this Israeli objective. And he thought he'd get his piece of the cake. And I don't think that piece that he has taken was worth all that he's done. And it's not even worth it for Turkey, because this, as I said, is becoming a black hole. So basically in Syria, you have a country that's falling apart. It's moving towards fragmentation, balkanization. And as I said, as long as Mr. Erdogan is president of Syria, well, he's also president of Syria too, in a sense. But as long as he's president of Turkey, I think that it's going to be very difficult for different countries, including Iran, to really get very far with him. So when it comes to business, there's cooperation, but when it comes to politics, it's difficult. You mentioned the Azov soldiers that he sent to Ukraine in violation of his agreement with the Russians. Well, that's exactly what he did in Syria. After his extremists were losing in Syria, and after the government, along with Russian, Iran, Hezbollah, and others, were able to take back key parts of northern Syria, he did a deal. He pushed Russia and Iran to accept that these extremist forces remain in parts of Syria. Now, Iran was more skeptical, but the Russians wanted the deal. The Iranians did not trust him because they have a longer history with him. And ultimately, the Iranians were right. Erdogan, he said that I cannot take these people inside Turkey. It's going to be a big problem. So ultimately, they had agreement where they stayed in Idlib. But ultimately, what the Iranians were concerned about happened, and they took over Syria. But now, although, as I said, it's going to be a problem, but I think some of Erdogan's policies are coming back to haunt him. And that is that is causing countries like Iran and Russia to be more cautious about him. And I think it's going to make it more difficult for Turkey under Erdogan to achieve its objectives in future, especially now because of his rivalry with the Israeli regime in Syria, where the Israelis, thanks to Western support, have the upper hand. I think that's all of these are going to become problems for the Turkish government in future, increasingly difficult problems.
Yeah, I think that part of the regime change was always not planned properly. What happens after Assad is gone and the common interest of removing him are gone, and all the new competing interest of post-Assad Syria comes to the surface. My last question though was just about how you see the role of China and Russia in the region, because my main impression has been that they would like to avoid alliance systems, simply because it means if you choose one, you choose away the other. So, for example, with the Chinese, they really wanted to they prioritize, obviously, the need to get along with Iran. They see Iran as a key partner, but they would also like to get along with countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar. So so they had this incentive to try to, um, if not only for economic interest, like the Belt and Road, but to seek this diplomatic bridge between the Gulf states and Iran. And the Russians, I think, have seen it the same way. They would like to be as close as possible with Iran, especially now that they're pursuing this Eurasian future, which Iran suddenly is elevated to one of its key strategic partners. But at the same time, they don't want to alienate the Arabic states. So again, you have this, would like to avoid alliance systems where you alienate their opposing part. That being said, there's the region, the politics of the regions does impact this. So, for example, with Russia, Israel, they always wanted to balance this one, but now with Israel having backed Ukraine in the war against Russia, and also that Iran is becoming more important, you see the priorities shifting quickly towards Iran, and less empathy towards the Israeli position. And I guess for the Chinese, I assume they see it similar way with Azerbaijan. That is, if Turkey is moving into its growing influence with Azerbaijan, disrupting Iran, Armenia, that this is something that also causes a problem for the Chinese. And again, Russia, China has to also manage the America's position in the region, which is very much focused on the alliance system. That is, if you can keep Iran as an enemy, or bad relations between the Gulf states and Iran, then you can weaken Iran, and you will also have the obedience of the Gulf states if they have an Iranian threat on their borders. So you always, so there's a lot of games being played at once, I guess. I was just wondering do you see the Chinese and Russians changing their position in the region somehow, or how do they play into this wider tensions or conflicts that also Iran is being pulled into?
I think the model that Iran pursues is very different from the American model, or the model pursued by the West. And the West has proxies in the region, allies in the region, the main ally, of course, the key ally being the Israeli regime. Iran does not want a military alliance with either China or Russia or with anyone. It wants very close relations. And I think that's the same is true in Moscow and Beijing, that the relationships are growing closer. Iran cooperates with the Russians. They've helped the Russians during the war, especially during the period where things were difficult for the Russians. It was Iranian drones that were very important in preventing things from getting worse in Ukraine. And the Russians then also sell products to Iran. There was discussion a while back that the Russians wanted to sell certain air defense systems to Iran, but the Iranians refused. That's not accurate. The Iranians and the Russians have been cooperating. The Russians have their own limitations. Part of it is because of the 2 million Russians that are in Israel. And the second is, of course, that the Russians are very much focused on their own war. It's a very intense war. It's always been very intense. When I compare, for example, when Saddam Hussein, supported by the West, invaded Iran, it was almost 8-year-long war. The casualties in the war in Ukraine today are far higher than the casualties in the war between Saddam Hussein and Iran because of the intensity. So Russia has its hands full. So that's another issue. But the relationship between Iran and Russia have evolved. The Russians know very well that any success by the Americans in the Persian Gulf region or West Asia is very bad news for Russia. And the same is true with China. China also is concerned about. So I think that the events in our region are drawing Russia, Iran, and China closer to each other. You can see that happen just in the last few weeks, let's say. But Iran does not want the Chinese and the Russians to distance themselves from countries in the Persian Gulf region. It's exactly the opposite. even though Iran has big problems right now, just as Erdogan conspired with Netanyahu and Biden, and of course, before Biden, Trump and Obama to undermine Syria, right now, Saudi Arabia is working with the United States and Israel to undermine Lebanon. And we have huge tensions right now in Lebanon over uh, the, 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 uh, the arms of the resistance of Hezbollah. And the next couple of days are going to be very sensitive days in Beirut, as this is going to be discussed in the cabinet and the decision will be made. And so the Saudis are working against the resistance, just like Erdogan was working against the resistance, and both of them in favor of the Americans and the Israelis. However, what Iran wants in the Persian Gulf region is for the Chinese and the Russians to have a stronger presence, a stronger political and economic presence, helps draw these countries away from complete dependency on the United States and creates more room for maneuver. Iran didn't have to include China for rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia wanted rapprochement, and there was progress made in Baghdad and in Oman, uh, in Muscat, when the two sides were negotiating. But when China, when the Saudis put this to the Chinese and the Chinese put it to the Iranians agreed. Why? Because a stronger Chinese presence weakens the American presence. A stronger Russian influence weakens NATO influence. So for Iran, Iran does not want the Chinese to choose between the west side of the Persian Gulf or the eastern side or the northern side of the Persian Gulf or the southern side of the Persian Gulf. Iran wants, and if the United States was smart, they would have done the same thing. But the United States increasingly is marginalizing everyone across the world. But over the past few decades, their policy was very different in the Persian Gulf region. So I think that what Iran seeks is stronger ties with Russia, with China, with India. Iran knows that India has strong relations with the United States and sadly with the Israeli regime. But Iran is trying to draw India further away from the United States. India has very good ties with the United States, and Iran has no great expectations. But the point is, even a small degree of change has a huge impact. And so by trying to be a part of this larger group of countries that tilt a bit further away from the West, some more, some less, Russia more, China more, India much less, Brazil, a bit more than India probably. By trying to push these countries to the degree that it can away from the West, Iran feels that this is good for the region and it's good for the country. So in the region. And so what Iran would like to see is a stronger Asian influence on West Asia and a weaker North American influence. And the reason why I say North American influence is that I think that over the last decade, Europe has basically disqualified itself from having any role because they've undermined their influence in Russia. They've undermined, when we had the nuclear negotiations 3.5 years ago, and I was in Vienna, the war in Ukraine happened as the negotiations were taking place. And I was telling European elites and journalists who would come and speak with me that now that you've, cut ties with Russia, you will have an energy crisis in the years ahead. You're moving towards a harsh winter with expensive fuel, and we saw how that negatively influenced European economies, and that continues as we speak, because when it was obvious that this war was not going to end overnight. So it was in the interest of the Europeans to do a deal with the Iranians so that they could have Iranian gas and they could invest in Iran's gas and oil, uh, and increase and decrease their their reliance on other sources, but they didn't do that. So they lost Russia, they lost Iran, and then of course they are now fully dependent on the United States. So it's basically North American influence, and what the Iranians are seeking is to decrease that influence on West Asia.
There's this complicated games all the time. I feel being played. It's same as in Syria now. It's the idea that yes, in the West, the view is well, Turkey's role now is a bit problematic. For one, of course, backing the jihadists, which we're making peace with it, but still, but also the tensions it has with Israel. But the logic one gets into then is, well, if Turkey doesn't have this influence there, then Iran might. So one ends up, as a we, I mean, the NATO ends up backing actors and policies which it knows kind of is detrimental to its long-term interests. I think most people understand that Jelani and yeah, Turkey's growing influence there is not going to be helpful. But even for objectives such as backing Israel, which is, should be questioned whether or not that should be an objective as well. But one gets locked into the strange games. I did forget to ask about the Kurdish issue, because as the PKK is now weakening, if not disintegrating, what will this mean for Erdogan? Because this has been good for him to hold on to power, and we've seen in the last few days a crackdown as well on opposition protesters. So how do you see the role of Erdogan? How solid is the ground he stands on? This is always a problem when you defeat your opponents. Suddenly, some of the legitimacy or purpose for for having the power to begin with can start to wane away.
Well, I think when you look at the broader picture, he's actually done more to hurt Turkey with regards to these issues through what he did in Syria than any success that he's had. Um, because Syria right now is controlled by much of Syria, the north east of Syria in particular, and the east of Syria is controlled by uh, Kurdish proxies of the West. And that is much more problematic than some official statement by a PKK leader in jail. So I think that the problems that he's caused for Turkey by undermining Syria have only increased. And I should add that, and remind your viewers that actually, and as you said, you're absolutely correct. The West's interests are not in fragmenting and balkanizing this region. And we already saw that when the huge numbers of Syrians went to Europe with Erdogan's while Erdogan was pushing them. So he carried out this dirty war with the support of the West, regional dictatorships, the Israeli regime. And all these refugees went to Turkey. Then he opened the gates and let them go to Europe, and that changed European politics. Remember Brexit, it was it happened with a very small majority. And back then, they were campaigning, like Farage and others, with these posters of Syrians coming, in these huge crowds of Syrians moving towards Europe. So he changed, that changed the balance of power, and European politics were also changed as a result of what happened in Syria. So these policies serve the interests of the Israeli regime, but not Europeans, not the West, and not Turkey. Doesn't it, the Erdogan, when they speak about Iranian influence in Syria, the Turkish influence in Syria was much greater than Iranian influence. Iran had good relations with Syria, but we didn't have large business relations. We didn't have a military presence. Syria facilitated Iran's support for the resistance, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, and so on, and the secular groups, Palestinian groups, and other groups. But Syria's relationship with Iran wasn't that close. As I said, Erdogan and his wife would go on weekend vacations with with the Assad president, former President Assad, and his wife. they pushed Syria towards Iran. And as I said, Iran didn't even get involved until the CIA and Turkish intelligence and Western intelligence agencies facilitated tens of thousands of fighters uh, i- into their presence inside Syria. And these many of them were recruited from Europe, from I don't want to create problems, but through cultural centers, let's say, influenced by Wahhabism and Salafism, under with the full knowledge of Western intelligence agencies across Europe and North of Africa and elsewhere. So it was only then that Iran got involved. So Iran didn't have a strong presence in Syria before then, before 2013. But in any case, yes, I would argue that what happened in Lebanon, what happened in Syria, what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, these were all in the interests of the Israeli regime. And none of them were in the interests of the Europeans in particular. Look at the rise in migration from Africa through Libya, the rise, as I said, from West Asia to Turkey, and the changes that have taken place in European politics as a result, and the rise of anti-immigration and often racism, and the shift in the balance of the political balance of power in Europe as a result. But of course, when it comes to the interests of, it's the different interests. It's Israel first.
Yeah, well, I just, yeah, I guess on a footnote there, I like what you said that this is pointing out that this is not necessarily or not in the West's interest either. And I think this is the main problem we're having, especially here in Europe, that these debates aren't actually taking place. We don't start with the point of departure. What is in our interest? And to get to this objective, what policy should we pursue? Instead, everything becomes this tribal mentality where it's either you choose our side, which is the policies which we now have, which I think we got entangled into by it doesn't make any sense anymore. Or if you criticize it, then you're essentially supporting what Russia, China, Iran, others are doing. So in other words, dissent becomes a form of treason, but no one really discusses the extent to which the security competition with the Russians, Chinese, Iranians could be mitigated. Because if you could, there's no inherent reason why we need these conflicts to begin with. I mean, if we go back, look at the policies which we pursued, that is the destruction of Iraq, destruction of Libya, destruction of Syria, the attack on Iran's nuclear facilities, backing a genocide in Gaza. What it did is, yeah, we had after this mass migration, political instability. The EU went from a economic project to a geopolitical project, which has been just a disaster. Even with the Russians, if we could go back, not topple the government in Ukraine in 2014, Crimea would still be Ukrainian. There would be a neutral buffer. We would have functioning relations with Russia. We have energy. We wouldn't have the deindustrialization. Like we can't discuss. This is seen, questioning what we've done is seen as an attack on choosing the opposing side. But no one can really explain to me why any of these things has been good for us. It's just all this assumption is if it's bad for the opponent, no one questions why they have to be an opponent. If it's bad for them, it's good for us. It's always this zero-sum mentality which tend to prevail. Again, as a political realist, I tend to view the world very much often in zero-sum, but there are opportunities to mitigate this, and this just, I think the irony is because we always look through the world as, values, which becoming a bit ironic, we always see it as, good versus bad, us versus them. Everything is always, zero-sum, so it's very frustrating to watch these policies. Same with the attack on Iran. Some excitement in the media, and it's like, but why? What is expected to be achieved? And of course, now the dust has settled. This must have been the worst, dumbest thing we could possibly have done in the Middle East. The political West, the unpredictability now. I mean, this is just, it's beyond comprehension. Yet the only thing the political media establishment seem to hear is, do you stand with us or them? And this is it. This is like a loyalty test, no matter how stupid the policies are and how self-destructive. No discussions anymore about if our security interests can be harmonized with Iran. What do they want? To what extent can we reach a compromise? Even Henry Kissinger, this was his main argument always. If you recognize the opposing side as a great power or as a major power, the first thing you should do is find out where interests can be harmonized, where compromise can be met. And if it can't, then we can fight it out. But we never do the first step. We always go to fighting out. It's extremely frustrating. But, here we are.
Well, you know that, you know better than I that while we've been always critical of the West, the leaders of, in the age of, um, the, 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 the Cold War, when people like Kissinger were in charge of foreign policy in the United States, regardless of the criticism, they were far more sophisticated and far more grounded in their policymaking. Nowadays, Western leaders and elites are lightweights, and when they speak, you just simply can't take them seriously. And it's interesting how they're demolishing their own credibility across the world, because as you were saying, one of the key points that they say to themselves and to their own people and to the rest of the world is that they have values. But what's happening in Gaza is making them look like the Nazis of our time. And their insistence on continuing to support the Israeli regime and their refusal to punish the regime, that is all being seen across the world as hypocritical and sinister as can be. And this is demolishing Western standing. It's not just Israel. Israel is looked down upon across. We saw yesterday's rally in Australia. Huge numbers under rain. The world is changing in the West as well, but across the world, the West, which has always tried to present itself as superior, is being seen as a sinister force. The states, the regime, the deep states, and so on. So they're undermining themselves not just economically, politically, and militarily in their confrontations with Russia and our region and China, but also they're showing themselves to be morally inferior. And that, I think, during the unipolar moment when they had a sort of monopoly over media and propaganda, that sort of reverse all their hard work. And it's very interesting, Glenn, that they succeeded in demonizing Iran. This is just a case example. They succeeded in demonizing Iran for decades through their media, through diplomacy, and also regional media. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, they've always moved against Iran. Qatar has many media outlets, so do the Saudis, so do the Emiratis, through sectarianism, racism, and so this coalition of the West and its regional proxies have succeeded in antagonizing Iran in the eyes of people in many parts of the world. But ever since the genocide in Gaza began, we see that the Ansarullah in Yemen, or the Houthis as the West calls them, which were antagonized in the region and across the world, they become heroes. The axis of resistance they become heroes. And Iran today, which has always been attacked, both through sectarianism in the region, racism in the region, and in the West through hosts of different multiple narratives that all work within the same framework, all of that has fractured. All of that has fallen. Iran has now become popular across the region and beyond because it is steadfast against the Israeli regime. It is the only country alongside Yemen that's opposed to the genocide, that's paying a price in opposing this Holocaust as we see it. So the West has demolished itself within the framework of a couple of decades, with its endless wars, with its pushing NATO eastwards, its antagonism towards China, and doing all of these at the same time. So right now, as they are carrying out this genocide in Gaza and supporting the Israelis, they're also antagonizing China simultaneously. They're also at war with the Russians. They're also at war with Iran. They're also at war against the so-called BRICS, whatever that means, because BRICS is it's not NATO or anything like that. They're even antagonizing India to a degree, even though I think they'll ultimately come to some sort of arrangement with India, but still their behavior, U.S. behavior towards India is going to have an impact. The way in which Trump suddenly turns against the Indians and insults them. And of course, you have Epstein, this whole Epstein affair, which is not going to go away. So they've turned, it's sort of like one of those, uh, uh, I don't watch sports that much, but one of those football matches where one team is ahead 3-0 and then they suddenly lose the game. The West had everything in the 1990s. They were at the top of the world. They had defeated Saddam Hussein in Kuwait. They dealt with the ghosts of Vietnam, rightly or wrongly. They defeated the Soviet Union, whether they really defeated it or it collapsed on its own. That's probably a more complicated affair than it seems. But instead of pursuing policies to maintain their own hegemony, they pushed too far and they pushed against everyone. And this is going to be in human history, the empire that has collapsed in the shortest amount of time.
Well, this is problem of global hegemony. You have to go after everyone at the same time. There's no priority. It goes the very predictable thing critics said in the 90s. There's going to be overextension. It's going to be spend all the resources. It's going to manifest itself as socioeconomic, political instability. Meanwhile, the major powers of the world will start to come together for collective balancing of the West. And again, it's coming into play, but there's no course correction. And this is what is extremely frustrating, because I think ideology locked down these policies and there's zero acceptance for dissent. So it's, yeah, anyways, Professor Marandi, always great to speak with you. So thanks again for your time.
It's always a pleasure, Glenn. Thank you very much for inviting me.